Welcome to the Darien Library. I'm Louise Berry, the library director, and I'm delighted to introduce our first Meet the Author program as a part of our adult summer reading program. Our author tonight is an award-winning short story writer whose first novel, Commuters, has received critical acclaim and has just recently been published. All of us in the Darien Library that have read this book, Commuters, and I'm one of them, absolutely love it. And for those of you who realize that the author's father is Alan Gray, the Assistant Director for Operations in the library, you'll be relieved to know that the book doesn't have a single spreadsheet in it. Commuters is listed as a best new paperback by Entertainment Weekly and has been described as lovely and literate, deeply satisfying, wonderfully cohesive, thoroughly engrossing, and relevant and contemporary. Our author tonight has been compared to both Virginia Woolf and Ann Tyler and has been described as exceptionally adept and an elegant novelist. It is with great pleasure that I introduce to you Emily Gray Tedrowe.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming. Can you hear me? Everything okay with the mic? It's so nice to see everybody out here tonight. I want to give a big thank you to Louise and to Erica Bess and to Barbara Thomas and to everyone at Darien. They've just made me feel so welcome and I'm thrilled to be here. There's one other person I want to thank. I want to thank my dad, not only for letting me crash his place of work to talk about my book, but for showing me by his example what a joy it is to be a lifelong reader and to love books. I mean, raise your hand if you spent your childhood watching Dad read nonstop while we all played around him. That would be my 3 siblings, right? So whether I inherited this from him, this love of books, or learned by watching him, it's really been the greatest gift of my life. So I just want to thank my dad. So I'm not nervous at all. I'm not. And I think it's because I'm here in a library, and libraries are where I'm at home. In fact, my first ever solo expedition out of the house when I was a young girl was to my town's public library. I would take a brown paper bag lunch that my mom would pack, and I would walk the 4 blocks down to our public library, and I would walk inside and sit in the children's room. I can remember everything. I remember the way the chairs felt, the fabric on them. I can remember the names of all the librarians. I can remember which trees were right outside which windows, and of course I can remember the order of the books on the shelves. I would read all morning, and at lunchtime I would walk outside and sit on the back steps and eat my lunch, and then I would come back inside and spend the rest of the afternoon deciding which books to check out and bring home. My siblings are really doing a good job of restraining themselves because this is the story that they like to tell when they're explaining what a dork I am. In fact, the first ever time I saw a real live writer was at my town's public library. My mom let me stay up late to go see Madeleine L'Engle, the children's author, who came to speak at our library. And I remember sitting there and being amazed that this woman at this desk had written these books that meant so much to me. It was like a really seminal event for me. I couldn't believe that this lady was the one who had given me so much pleasure in her books. And I stood online and I had her sign my copy of A Swiftly Tilting Planet. So it's hard for me to believe that this is me here now about to do the same thing. Not that I'm assuming I'll be signing any books. I mean, should someone buy a book, I'd be happy to sign it. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about my novel. It's my first novel, and the title is Commuters. It's set in a small, fictional, upstate New York town, one that's on the Metro North line. I think at one point I even specified that it's the New Haven line, but don't ask me to get geographical about it. And the title, Commuters, is meant to reflect several of the novel's themes. One is that sense, which you all here in Darien might know about, of the back and forth travel between suburbs and city, between your job and your home, between one version of your life and another. When you're on that train, you're in a kind of a liminal space. You're between. You're not in one place and you're not in the other. So that description, I hope, reflects the space that my characters find themselves in, my three main characters, in the year that this novel covers. Today, we think of the word commuters as almost having this drudge connotation, this shuttling back and forth endlessly, never really getting anywhere, the repetition of commuting. But as one of my characters points out, the root word commute means to change or exchange, to give one thing in exchange for another. It also means to exchange one thing for something less severe, as in when a prisoner has his sentence commuted. In the 1840s, with the origin of the suburbs in the New York area, the railroad company began to commute the fares of the men who were traveling every day back and forth. They would charge them less in order to continue having their continued patronage. So as Nick Palmgarten points out in a recent New Yorker article, in time, the commuted became commuters. So in that more metaphorical sense, what I hope is that my title tries to underline what is changing or being exchanged or being traded in each of these three characters' lives. The central event in the book is the marriage of Winnie Easton, a 78-year-old widow and grandmother, to 80-year-old Jerry Trevis, whom she's only known for 3 months. I thought I would talk a little bit about my inspiration for this, which is the seed of the novel. I was very close to my mother's mother, as was all of our family, and I would go visit her down south for several weeks each summer. And one summer when I was 15, one of my grandmother's best friends announced that she was remarrying. And this set up a big upheaval in my grandmother's world of these close family friends. And I remember being captivated by this event and just wanting to know everything about it. I loved the way my grandmother and her women friends were talking and planning and gossiping and teasing. They might have even occasionally talked a little bit risque in terms of sex when they thought I wasn't listening, and in the way that only proper Southern ladies can. And so this had a big effect on me at 15. And then I seemed to file it away and forget about it. Later on, as I was an adult and I began to think about it again, I started playing the what if game. What if there was a huge disparity in money between these two people who were remarrying late in life? What if not everyone in their families were thrilled about the marriage? What if falling in love conflicted with your obligations to your family and neighbors? And then, maybe especially, what if all of this played out against the background of small-town gossip? What I kept imagining turned into the plot of this novel. And it lifted me away from what I knew in real life. That is, I didn't know that much about the specifics of my grandmother's friend's marriage. And so I did learn more about my characters the more I imagined about them in this situation. But I didn't want to tell just Winnie's story from her own viewpoint. I think part of my interest in the situation was wondering how her marriage could or would affect other people. So maybe you've recognized that in your own lives, that there are times when someone else's main event affects you, as if there are ripples coming outward from a pond when a stone's been thrown into it. Ripples that cause change and havoc and maybe even new opportunities in your own life. So I decided to tell the story of a year in the life of three characters and what happens to them because of Winnie's sudden marriage. So the book alternates their perspectives, one chapter at a time, as if it's braided by three different stories. So what I thought I'd do to introduce you to the novel is to talk a little bit about these three main characters and who they are, and then to read a short excerpt from each of their first chapters. So, Winnie. I'll take a drink of water first. As the novel opens, Winnie is sitting in the balcony of the church. She's sitting alone, and it's on her wedding day. She's gone up there by herself to get some perspective on what's changed in the 60 years between the day she stood in that very same church and married her first husband and today. Winnie's lived her whole life in Hartfield, where her father was considered the town's founder, having worked for the railroad and created the station stop that linked their small town to Metro North. She raised 2 children in that town, one of whom, Rachel, lives in Hartfield also, with her husband and 2 teenage daughters. Winnie's life up to now has consisted of the daily routines of life in a small town. She helped her daughter's family through a hard time. She volunteered. She spent a lot of time with friends. In a way, she sort of took a lot for granted about the dailiness of her life and her role in this place. So when Jerry enters her life and the town, it changes almost everything. Even though Jerry has a lot of money, and that's very different for Winnie, she chooses to ignore it. She pretends it doesn't matter much and won't change much about her way of life. So what I was really interested in was Winnie's internal life. Although she was married for several decades, it's only now, for the first time with Jerry, that she's experiencing real love. I wanted to know how much would she be willing to change about her life to accommodate how she feels about him. So I'm going to read you a little part from the first chapter of the book. Winnie didn't have illusions about the sentimentality of this occasion, those unnecessary details that probably most of the guests, and some from her own family even, would see as trivial or self-indulgent. She didn't need all this, the ring, the dress, but oh, she loved how she looked in this dress. The lavish reception to come, she knew how it looked. Winnie's social circle was composed mostly of other longtime widows, and there was a history of light jokes about the phenomenon of two older people coming together late in life. She knew all the usual arrangements, all the wink and nudge euphemisms, those companions or special friends. Why bother with anything formal, anything official? But when a man like Jerry Trevis said he wanted to get married, he meant married. He hadn't moved to tiny Hartfield from Chicago for anything else. And there was this. Winnie ran her palm across the smooth surface of her dress. The truth was, she wanted the stay too. The pomp and show of it, the public display. She had married once because it was a good match, mostly for her parents and his. That was how things were done, and she hadn't argued with it. But now she found herself about to do something that felt like the first thing she'd ever done on her own. And maybe that called for a lot of witnesses, the gratuitous flowers, a tiered and too sweet cake. She was marrying a man for the delicious and wicked and simple reason that she wanted to. Not everyone saw it that way. Earlier in the day, Winnie and Jerry had posed together for a photograph on the sloping lawn in front of the church, next to the welcome signboard, where their own names were spelled out in white plastic letters below today's date. Above that, for the morning wedding, another couple's names were listed, which only slightly ruined the effect. For the occasion, Winnie had agreed to be interviewed by a reporter from the local paper. She often was, a frequent obligation, part of her role as the daughter of what many considered to be the town's founder, the man who had linked Little Hartfield to New York City. Dutifully, she gave her quotes when asked and had learned not to argue with young people's fascination with the past, especially those awful railroad aficionados. They were relentless. But she had hoped for more this time. She wanted to explain what it was like, meeting Jerry just 3 months ago, how she had never expected to be in love again, and what it took to upend your placid and settled life, the one you led with dignity, the one people expected of you. At times, what I feel is closer to regret than anything else, Winnie had told the reporter. Maybe that's inevitable. After all, most of my life will have been spent without Jerry, and getting married now keeps bringing that to mind. So then all this happiness actually, yes, the polite reporter said, nodding. Her pen hovered over the pad, unmoving. So interesting. Can you tell me exactly how old Mr. Trevis is, and confirm your birth date? And so, little by little there on the soft church lawn, Winnie discovered the reporter's agenda, a fluff piece, a throwaway, something to warm the heart. She and Jerry were meant to be a symbol of hope springing eternal and all that. How could it be otherwise? She and Jerry couldn't be themselves. They had to be much bigger than that. They were the human interest. Below her, most of the guests had been seated by now, although there was the usual waving and arranging of places as people called to each other and organized themselves. The front of the church, though, by the altar was still empty. Jerry and the minister would enter from one of the side doors. If she saw that happen, Winnie thought she'd really have to hustle down there. Still, she sat and watched. That minister, a nice young man, about 35, maybe 40, nervous and a little overeager, he'd met with them a few weeks ago to discuss the order of the ceremony, what hymns and which order, and who would do the readings. At one point, though, she couldn't understand what he was going on about. He was explaining something quite earnestly, with grave import. Finally, she gathered that the minister was letting them know that the phrase, promise to obey, was now commonly omitted from the vows, and the various reasons and so on. He seemed quite intent on the point, and he was a little disconcerted when Winnie couldn't help a short burst of laughter, Jerry's hand in hers. She understood the changing politics that made this seem necessary to a younger person. But what did this minister think he was protecting her from? She had no qualms about promising to obey Jerry. In any case, so much of marriage was unspoken, was made up of two people striving for kindness and respect in a countless series of actions and gestures, day in and day out. It was touching, the way the minister wanted to get these mere words right. Well, all right, she had told him, if it makes you feel more comfortable. So one of the interesting things to me in writing from the viewpoint of several characters experiencing the same event was to imagine how differently they might feel or see what's really happening. So what I did was in the first 3 chapters of the novel, I placed each of the 3 characters at the same event, Winnie's wedding. Before the wedding, during the beginning of the reception, and at the end of the reception. So the second character in the novel is Rachel. Rachel's in her mid-40s. She's the mom of 2 teenage daughters. She lives in Hartfield and has that kind of relationship with where she talks to or sees her mom almost every day. Rachel's family's recovering from something that happened to them 2 years ago. Her husband had a traumatic brain injury at a mysterious accident somehow at the house. They still don't know exactly how it happened, and Rachel, after they survived this event, has become obsessed with finding out exactly how it happened to her husband. So she spent the past few years helping him heal, holding her family together, and now she's facing the loss of her house because of their financial problems. So in the middle of all this, her mother falls in love and throws a huge wedding. So I'll read a little bit from Rachel's chapter. And now it gives me great, great pleasure to introduce to you the bride and groom. But the band leader was drowned out by the room's sudden outburst of warm applause, and even a few hooting cheers. Before he could finish the phrase Rachel had been most curious to hear aloud, Mr. and Mrs. Jerome Trevis. She stood to the side of the Waugatuck Tennis Club's main dining room and watched her mother gaily cross the dance floor on Jerry's arm, a green disco spotlight swirling around them. Ladies and gentlemen, their first dance. A respectful hush fell across the crowd as the Moonlight Express band swung easily into Night and Day, and Winnie put her hand lightly on Jerry's upper arm where the fabric of his suit was all bunched up. Rachel Brigham was having trouble experiencing this moment, in which her nearly 80-year-old mother danced with her new husband on their wedding day. All she could sense was the pressure of expectation from friends and neighbors throughout their small town, even those not invited. Was she supposed to cry? Smile? Both? Everyone Rachel had talked to in the weeks leading up to this event, from the caterer's assistant to customers at the store to Lisa, her dental hygienist, had wanted to know, how does it feel? With an airlock-tight gaze fixed on her, they would ask, what was it like for Rachel to see her mom fall in love again this late in life? Wasn't it unbelievably sweet and hopeful? Wasn't it a testament to the power of something? Maybe what they wanted was a little dirt. To have her express a fraction of dismay, some sense of loss about her father, dead now 12 years, or even for her to slip quickly into a knowing ridicule. After all, there was plenty that was ridiculous about all of this. The band, the arranged flowers, the cake, all produced for a couple whose combined age spanned a century and a half. More than once, Rachel had suffered pangs of embarrassment on her mother's behalf while helping to plan this wedding that everyone in town had been talking about. Why couldn't Winnie have had a small ceremony with Judge Greenberg and then a lunch at La Finestra for 20, maybe 30 people? But one of her mother's best and most infuriating qualities was a blithe disregard for what other people would think. Most of the time, Rachel found this admirable, or wanted to. She watched Winnie step tremulously, lightly, back and forth to the syrupy music, Jerry's big arms held stiffly around her. Why were the most important things the hardest to say? The friends who wanted a glimpse at Rachel's emotions said nothing, asked nothing, about what had really changed for her. Nothing about the obvious fact of Jerry's money and the sudden immense difference between what her mother now had and what she herself did not. How could they, when Rachel and Winnie themselves had addressed it only through the most fleeting, joking comments? For example, what they imagined Jerry's high-powered daughter Annette must think of Hartfield's one hair salon, where men's cuts were still $14, and women crowned with tinfoil took amiable turns under the chipped pink metal hood of the one ancient dryer. Did they want her to admit that it had been a long, long time since a man had held her the way Jerry was holding her mother out there on the dance floor? Well, she could do that. She'd be the first to do that, say how long it had been. As she stood there watching, Winnie tipped her head down slowly and knocked her forehead ever so softly against Jerry's chest. He reached under her chin and lifted her face, all the while they kept dancing, so that when their eyes met again, he could say something to her without words. Yes, I'm here. Yes, this is really happening. Rachel held herself very, very still. It had been such a long time. So, one of the last things I'll say about the structure of the book is that what I was also interested in considering an event from the perspectives of different viewpoints, is to think about different generations. So I've already talked to you about Winnie and her daughter, Rachel, who's in her 40s. I was also interested in how might a younger person view this marriage? And would he even be affected by it? I mean, is it possible for someone who's 20 years old to really, truly have his life changed by his grandfather's marriage? So in a way, writing about the next character was kind of a challenge I set for myself. Avery, the third of the three main characters, is 20 years old. He's Jerry's grandson from Chicago, and he spent the last 2 years recovering from a drug addiction. In his words, moving through, quote, rehab stint 1, and then college take 2, and then live at home / look for a job, and then rehab redux. This time we mean business. As the wedding happens, he's just moved to Manhattan to live on his own for the first time. He wants to try to break into the restaurant business. This is a tenuous proposition that his parents are allowing only because his grandfather has just moved to Hartfield in the same area. They've told Avery that he needs to keep checking in with his grandfather, something that infuriates him, makes him feel like a baby. But secretly, his parents also want Avery to keep an eye on Jerry as well, because Jerry's side of the family in Chicago is not thrilled, to say the least, about this marriage. So as we meet Avery, he's just met the woman who's going to change his life. They've just had this instant crazy connection, despite the fact that she's much older than him. It gets pretty sexy, even in their first meeting, but I think I'm not going to read from that part to this audience. Hi, Mom. Hi, Dad. So I'm going to read instead from Avery. He's on his first visit to Hartfield. He's at his grandfather's wedding, and it's at the end of the reception. Enough of Hartfield already. Somewhere in the dark tangle of streets in this little town was the train station that could get him back to Manhattan. But where exactly, and how would he get there? What time did the trains run? Avery had none of the answers, but he wasn't too fazed. He'd figure it out. On his way to the door, though, he was stopped by a commotion in the country club foyer. A cluster of people, some kneeling, were gathered around an old woman lying on the floor. "Don't move her," the people were saying to themselves. "Give her some air." Avery edged closer and saw a thin line of blood running from the woman's nostril. Her eyes were closed, but she was breathing hard through her open mouth. He didn't recognize her, although that didn't mean anything. She must be a guest, maybe a friend of Granddad's or his new wife, just one of the many old people in attendance. It was revolting to see an old lady lying like that, he thought, flat on her back on the hard carpet of the entranceway. Why didn't someone cover her legs at least? They shouldn't be out in the open like that, all bony and ridged with veins. Avery stared at the shiny new sneakers on her feet, unable to look away. He owned the same brand, same style. Coming through, someone said, and Avery allowed himself to be pushed aside by the EMS guys and their wheeled stretcher. Not sure where to go, he wandered slowly outside. The soft suburban night air was filled with crickets or cicadas. A bat looped under the awning over the door. A feeling he'd had earlier in the day at the church flashed back to him. A horrible feeling, like a nightmare. There was everything in place for a wedding: the altar, the minister, the flowers, the bride's white dress, the groom in a suit, everything normal. Until you looked in the smiling faces of the marrying couple and saw how old they were, how gray and wrinkled and stooped. It was a warp-speed, fast-forwarded life, Twilight Zone stuff. Now suddenly all the parts of his grandfather's big day curdled inside Avery. He pulled his tie over his head and stuffed it in a pocket. What was the point? Sure, it was great how the old man had found someone again, this close to the end of his life. Everyone was saying so. But now it hit Avery just how insubstantial it all was. Love, marriage, compared to the hard physical reality of the world. The old lady on the floor in her neon sneakers, her bloody nose. This was coming soon for Granddad, whether he knew it or not. Wasn't it ridiculous for everyone to get all dressed up and pretend otherwise? Avery watched as one of the valet attendants tossed a pair of keys high into the dark air and then caught them behind his back, one-handed. Nice. Then he stepped off the porch and walked slowly into the lush night streets of Hartfield. He'd find his way to the train eventually. I'm going to stop there for my presentation, but if anyone's interested, I'm happy to answer some questions. Yes?
I'm two-thirds of the way through the book, and I'm having a very hard time putting it down.
Thank you.
That's good. You know, as I read, every once in a while, Winnie becomes an enigma. She's lived in Hartfield below these many years, and she has a certain code of conduct.
Right.
But every once in a while, she really turns into someone else. She wants what she wants when she wants it, and she doesn't necessarily want it for herself.
Right.
The part of the book about the facial discoloration, did you mean to present her as almost a dichotomy of her former life and now sort of looping into a new adventure? How did you see her?
Well, that's a really good question. And I think that you've pointed out something really important about Winnie that I'm glad is coming through, which is I think she is entering a new adventure. I think she's lived a placid and stable and comfortable life. And for the first time, she's feeling like a teenager. And sometimes she's acting like a teenager. And what this questioner pointed out was later in the novel, Winnie notices a patch of skin on her jaw that's become discolored. It's just a small facial blemish. And she becomes obsessed with it and is constantly checking in the mirror, hoping it'll go away, finding that it never has. And it's something very unlike her. She sort of prided herself on not being vain. But suddenly being in love, I guess, maybe makes you more aware of your appearance in a way that you hadn't been, and somewhat obsessed with it. So I don't know if that specifically answers your question.
Because, I was beginning to wonder if this was something that I was just reading into it, but every once in a while there was another small incident that you really had to pay. I love the way that you develop the characters slowly and cautiously, and then all of a sudden, boom, they're right in your face.
I hope it didn't startle you too much that they're right in your face. But thank you, I appreciate the comment. Does anyone else have a question? Or a comment? Yes, sorry, in the green shirt first.
Why did you choose this subject for the first book?
The subject of the marriage late in life, or?
Yes.
Well, you mean for my first book, meaning?
Yeah. Well, I think you've written short stories.
Right. Right.
First novel, excuse me.
Right. It is, yeah, first novel. I think that Are you suggesting that because maybe I'm younger, why would I choose to write about, is that, I mean, I just didn't, or just why in general? Yes, well, I think other than being really interested in my grandmother's friend's experience, this was my first novel, and it allowed me to move past the sort of stricter constrictions of the short story into a roomier sense of a person's life. And it seemed to naturally fit the form of a novel, thinking about the course of someone's life. Of course, I didn't write about Winnie's life from birth to old age, but I do have several scenes where I have her sort of ranging over long periods of time, thinking about her life, as in that first chapter, when she imagines 60 years ago I was here in this church, and here I am today. So I think to me, my interest in that subject, because of my grandmother's friend's experience, and this desire to write a novel, the two of them seem to go together well. I think someone else had a question. Yes, right here.
When did you know that you really wanted to write?
That is a good question. It took a while for me to recognize that what I really wanted to do was write, because I spent my whole life, and still do, being in love with reading. And so all I really ever wanted to do was read. And I thought of reading as completely essential. I needed stories, I needed books. I read them almost faster than I could procure them. And then later as an adult, it was almost extra hard for me to admit that I wanted to try to do that thing that had given me so much pleasure, because I thought, I don't need to write because I'm given such joy from reading. But for some reason I crossed over, and I just decided that because this is what I think is the most important thing in my life, reading fiction, I thought that I would try to emulate and be a part of it, some of the writers that had given me so much joy. So it wasn't until much later, maybe in my mid-20s, I would say, I started to write seriously. Other people? Let's see. In the yellow, pretty yellow shirt.
What did you do when your copy of the book arrived? What was the first thing that you thought?
Well, it was an awesome day. Thanks for asking that question. I knew it was coming that day, so I live in a building with a doorman. And I think I asked the doorman maybe 4 or 5 times before 8:30 in the morning if the UPS guy had come by. No, he hadn't. And then so, I'm embarrassed to admit this, but I'm going to. My daughter and I went outside in front of the building and waited for the UPS truck to come. And he parked in front of our building, but he said to me, oh, well, I was going to deliver this building's packages first. And I said, please, I just need you to go in there and find a package. It's just got a book in it, and I need it. And so he went in, and he got it for me, and he handed it to me. So I sat on the sidewalk and tore it open there, and showed the UPS guy, and he gave me a big high five. And then I took it inside and had my 4-year-old daughter take a lot of pictures of me, which I then put on Facebook. So it was fun. Other people? Yeah. Dr. Murray.
Tedrowe. Did you know before you wrote the book, while you were writing the book, or during writing the book, your characters?
The plot came to me sort of all at once. I just knew I wanted to write about that marriage and a year in the life of that marriage, and I instantly imagined the 3 characters who it was going to affect. I just knew their names and their basic situations. And then as I was writing it, I had a lot of fun learning more about them. But it's funny because I did spend, I wrote and revised this book over 2 or 3 years, and several things about it changed, but everything in this book, in terms of the main characters and their plot lines, was there in the moment that I imagined it. So I hope that happens again sometime. It'd be nice. Yes?
What about Jerry? How does he fit into this? Is he someone miscellaneous? I haven't read it even, so.
No, it's a great question. You know, writing about Jerry was one of my favorite parts about this book because he is a very traditional, take no guff kind of a man. And he is like a bulldog in his life. And he was the CEO of a company he built from scratch with his brother. And he is a man that is suddenly thrown into a world of love and family relationships, even though before this he's been kind of a take no prisoners businessman his whole life. So what happens to Jerry is that he needs to face the fact that he's no longer the top dog in his business. That's been turned over to his daughter, Annette, who is not happy about this marriage. So it sets them up for a pretty ugly intrafamilial battle. So no, I wouldn't say he's miscellaneous. I mean, he was is a really important part of the novel, but I'm not sure exactly why I didn't give him his own viewpoint, perspective. He's not one of the three main characters, the ones that I tell there. Mom, do you care? I'm just going to let my mom answer that question.
But what you'll really enjoy is this beautiful relationship between him and Avery, the grandson. There's an arc of that throughout the whole month that she didn't tell you about.
Okay. Well, thanks, Mom. There's a beautiful relationship that happens between him and his grandson. And yes, they sort of get to know each other as men together for the first time. So thanks for the question. Thanks for the answer. Yes, they're in the orange shirt.
You said that the plot all came to you at once, but from my perspective as a reader, and I won't give anything away, there were, a few, especially two distinctive, kind of huge shifts that caught me completely off guard. I mean, it was someone said over here, she takes her time you get to know the characters, and you're proceeding at one kind of pace, and then all of a sudden, something major happens, and then something else major happens, and it sort of is like a storm gathering momentum. And I'm wondering, did you know when it all came to you that those dramatic things were going to happen?
Well, without giving away what the dramatic things are, I think my answer is some yes, some no. I mean, I think what I imagined all in one instance is like the main arc for the three characters. But in the middle of that, yes, there were times when I had a lot of fun playing with what would happen, and I didn't exactly know, throughout the entire time I was writing. So I sort of knew the general outline, but had a lot of fun making up some, throwing some obstacles in their path, because you don't want it to be easy or comfortable for your characters, because that's not as fun to read about. Yes?
So I imagine while you were writing this in the years that it took you to write it, you had quite a relationship with your characters. So I'm wondering, now that the book is done, and now that you're, talking about them, what's it like now with your relationship with your characters?
Yeah, it's funny because I actually feel kind of protective of them. Like, I was just on the phone with my cousin this morning, and she said, gosh, I really love the novel. I said, thank you. And she said, wow, I really wanted to slap Winnie, though. And I won't give away because, it has something to do with the plot later. And I said, really? And I got a little offended, Just, I can't believe she did this and that. And so on the one hand, it feels wonderful to me that people can, have beef with my characters and get angry at them, because I did try to write a novel where the people were real and they make mistakes and they do things that are stupid and they hurt each other, because, that's the world we live in. And but I do now, after it's over, feel a little bit, protective and defensive, especially if someone wants to slap them. Yeah, Louise.
Emily, one of the things I loved about your book were all of the wonderful scenes related to food. That Avery wants to be a chef and wants to own a restaurant, but the food that he prepares, the food they talk about, the food that people are eating throughout the whole novel, the kitchen in Winnie's house. It's just incredible. Could you talk a little bit about your inspiration for all the foodie elements of the novel?
Sure. Thanks for the nice words about it. Yes, Avery is an ex-drug addict, and he's sort of moved on to his new addiction, which is food. He's become an obsessed foodie, one of these young Turk, hot young chefs. He wants to cook up everything and conquer the New York restaurant world. There's a lot in this novel about what he cooks and these crazy concoctions that he comes up with. And a lot of people have asked me, like, oh, you must be a chef. Haha, I hear people laughing. Or you must, eat out a lot. That doesn't happen either. So I think my inspiration for it was because I wanted Avery to be a very tactile, sensual person who's moved on from drugs to basically sex and food. So that's one of the ways he expresses himself as a person. He's 20. I mean, he's pretty passionate. And then as to how I ended up writing about the food, I didn't do specific research because I already had this weird predilection for reading about food while I eat. I don't know, but anytime I'm not at an official meal, like with my family, if I'm just eating my sandwich, I always like to read about food. So I will sometimes just pull out a cookbook and read it while I eat my sandwich. This is embarrassing, I don't know why, but and I also really like to read just profiles of chefs or restaurant reviews. I'm kind of interested in that stuff, even though I might have no plans to go to the restaurant or cook that, 20-step, beef bourguignon or something. So I had already read so much about food that I just let it jumble up in my head. And then when it came time for Avery to cook, I just made up the craziest, weirdest things that I could imagine that sort of had a slight basis in reality. It was a lot of fun writing those parts. Thanks. Yes?
Getting back to Avery, when the book started, I really didn't like it. But as the book went along, and I don't want to give anything away either, I really began to feel for him and liked him very much. When you created Avery, was what made Avery the beginning. That was intentional. The relationship with his mom.
His conflict with his mom.
Because basically, I think I saw the growth of Avery getting away from her to a certain extent.
Right. Yeah, thank you. That was one of my first ideas of Avery, is he's striking out on his own, maybe a little bit later than some people, and maybe having been a little more messed up than some people. But it is one of his sort of coming of age stories.
And another question: I love the cover on your book.
Thank
Do
you.
you have any input into it? Because you can take a look at it, and I think it expresses in just a picture what the book is really about, even the leaves around the outer edges.
Well, thank you. I love it too, and I feel really lucky. I didn't have any part in designing it. I was lucky to have a great team over at Harper Perennial who took charge of that. But I agree, my favorite part is peeking in the window to wonder what's happening, because I think that's how I feel about the book, is peeking into these families' windows and wondering what's going on at that table. Thank you. I don't know, do we have any other questions? Or maybe are we, yes, we do. John.
I was curious as to, I wondered if you just elaborate on the fact that all of these men are, in the main men in this book, the three main men are pretty badly injured, I guess I would call it, or wounded in some way. And I wondered if you just speak to that a little bit.
So let me see, I guess you're talking about Jerry.
Jerry and
His-
Avery
and Bob, Rachel's husband, that's the one who had the brain injury, and Avery. Well, that's very interesting. I'm not sure I've ever thought about it that way. It wasn't a specific rational decision I made to ding all of them with an injury. But I don't know. That's something for me to think about. Thank you. I'm interested in why I did that, but I have no answer for you. What do you think, Erica? Louise?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you, Emily. I read the book and loved the book, but this was very enlightening to hear your perspective on it. It's made it all that more enjoyable, so now I'll have to read it again. We have a wine and cheese reception here. We hope you'll stay and enjoy it and talk to Emily. Barrett Bookstore is here with copies of the book for sale, and Emily's happy to sign them. So and stay and enjoy.